unmute them.
Spiro, you're muted, Spiro.
All right. Way to start off the new year. Welcome everyone to our session here on the effects of land property rights. And we're going to have cases from 3 continents. I'm presiding. My name is Spiro Stefano. I'm the administrator of the Economic Research Service at USDA. And our moderator today is Robert Zabawa. He's a professor at Tuskegee University. We have 3 papers that we're going to have presented on this topic. Land property rights are fundamental to land security, land development, and agricultural development. So the 3 papers come from 3 different continents that are going to highlight the effects of the lack of land property rights. First paper looks at heirs property rights issues in the US. And in this paper, authors from the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta highlight a likelihood of land loss due to the precarity of shared ownership structure. I apologize, there's a snowplow right outside my window. The second paper, authors from the World Bank are exploring the lack of land property rights on land inheritance in Malawi. And in the third paper, we have authors from USDA Economic Research Service and South China Agricultural University looking at how the land property rights reduces the land abandonment problem by enhancing land property rights, especially in an unsecured property rights scenario. We have a discussant with us, Michael Carter from the University of California, Davis. And at this time, I'm going to pass it on to Robert to moderate the session. Robert, please take over.
All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm Robert Zabawa from Tuskegee University, and I'll be moderating this session. Each of the presentations will be 25 minutes long. And if you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat. And then when we will go over those questions if there is time between sessions. Otherwise, we will save it for afterwards. So the first paper, as was mentioned, is being presented by the Federal Reserve Bank and looks at heirs property in an urban context by Sarah Stein and Ann Carpenter. Please begin.
I'm going to share my screen so everyone can see if we can get this.
Very good.
Great. Are folks able to see that? Excellent. Yes. All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm Sarah Stein, and I'm here with my colleague, Ann Carpenter. We're both at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta here this morning to talk to you guys about some research we've been doing around heirs property in an urban context, specifically looking at a case study in Jacksonville, Duvall County, Florida. So a little outline of our research: heirs property status, which is property that's passed down through generations without a will. And we'll talk a lot more about what heirs property is and how it's created. This status complicates owner access to the benefits of land ownership and often does result in the loss of land. A lot of research has focused on rural heirs property, but this is also a prevalent issue in urban areas. And so we're conducting a Jacksonville, Florida case study to explore urban heirs property. Now, mostly we're interested in asking whether the characteristics and challenges of heirs property in urban context are consistent with rural heirs property. And what are the implications that exist for the Jacksonville families and the communities that surround these properties. And just a quick overview of some of the key findings we reached in our research. Urban heirs property shares many of the characteristics with rural heirs property. And we also actually found that neighborhoods with a higher share of Black population had significantly higher heirs property concentrations, and that there was significant overlap between historically redlined areas and higher concentrations of heirs property. we estimate that about $5 billion in land value is locked in heirs property countywide in the Jacksonville, Duvall area. And also we found that heirs properties tend to have higher exposure to flooding and less frequently are covered by flood insurance and hazard insurance as well. Now let's talk a little bit about heirs property and sort of what it is, because it's pretty key to understanding why we're looking at it. So heirs property is a home or land that's been passed between generations, resulting in multiple people owning the same piece of property as what is known as tenants in common. That's a legal term that describes when people own a piece of property together and everybody owns the entirety of the property. So it's not a divided thing, or some people own some rights and some people own other rights. It's everyone owns all of the property and all of the rights together. This is created when an owner dies without a will, which is often referred to as dying intestate, and the property passes to heirs at law, which are determined by state law in the United States. Each state has the laws that determine the passing of property to intestate, heirs of the intestate. So another way that heirs property can be created, however, is if an owner dies with a will, but the will leaves the property to multiple beneficiaries and doesn't specify, say, rights of survivorship. So when one person who receives the property dies, who will get it next? If that's not specified, then you've pretty much created a tenants in common heirs property situation with your will. It's not created if the piece of property is held in a trust or a corporate entity, or if the owner dies and does say what the rights of survivorship are in the recipients of the piece of property. Also wanted to mention that heirs property is sometimes referred to as tangled title. So if you ever heard that, that's pretty much the same conversation we're having. Quick overview of how heirs property is created in case you didn't completely grasp it. It can be kind of complex. So here we have a person in a house. It doesn't have to be a house, as I said, any piece of real property, but here, maybe this house is in Jacksonville, Florida. This person very unfortunately passes away. They don't have a will, let's say, but they have 3 heirs at law that can be identified. And the property passes, say, equally to each of those 3 heirs. So now and those 3 heirs own as tenants in common. So now they own the property together as tenants in common. Maybe one of them lives there, maybe all of them do, or none of them. Regardless, they all have that sort of owning it together rights, and they all have to kind of make the decisions together in order for things to happen, such as selling it or getting a mortgage, for instance. So then let's say one of the 3 unfortunately passes away and also perhaps doesn't have a will or somehow creates heirs property among 3 heirs in their passing. So now we have 5 people who own as tenants in common. If another person passes away, we have 7 people. And if the 3rd person passes away, we have 9. And then you can see how we start to see where 9 people, all of these people don't necessarily know each other or know that this piece of property even exists, especially when you start getting into further generations of folks who are maybe passing away and don't have wills or don't really understand that this is a piece of property they're in any way affiliated with, such that they're passing it to their heirs in the sort of crowd of people who are starting to own this house. So research has identified heirs property owners face a lot of different difficulties in their ownership of this property. It's important to note that heirs property is fundamentally an issue with the title to the property. This means that there's a lack of clarity regarding its ownership, and that results in difficulties benefiting from properties. So problems earning income from assets. So for instance, if you have timber on your land, there could be some real issues in selling that timber and benefiting from it. Also difficulties applying for or getting the full benefit of tax exemptions and other homestead eligibilities. Challenges selling or mortgaging the property. I mentioned that already. That's a big one. Difficulty repairing or improving the property. So actually a lot of folks find difficulties in insuring these properties against damage. So that right there could be a real barrier to keeping your property in good repair. Also challenges participating in government programs, such as those offered by USDA or HUD or FEMA. Oftentimes, if you don't have this very clear claim to title, your ability to access those resources is limited, if not completely barred. And that's also true for some private programs. And then there's also an increased likelihood of property loss. So increased risk of forced partition sales, which is when somebody in that, 7 to 50 person ownership crowd decides that they want their money out of the property, or there's another intervention oftentimes on the part of developers who are interested in a piece of property, might be able to use the tenants in common legal structure to force a partition sale, which can result in land loss for the other owners. Mortgage complications and increased risk of foreclosure, and also an increased risk of tax foreclosure sales. So a lot of risks in owning this form of what is essentially a default receipt of property through inheritance. Oops, wrong direction. Okay, so on to Duvall County, Florida, which is where we situate our research. Duvall County is located in the northeastern corner of the state of Florida. It is, it's actually a consolidated city county. So when we say Jacksonville or Duvall, we are actually talking about the exact same geographic area. And it's located on the Atlantic coast and bisected by the St. Johns River. Many parts of Duvall County are susceptible to flooding. And on the right, or in the sort of the middle here, you can see that Duvall County consists of predominantly low-lying areas measuring below 25 feet in elevation. Our analysis examines past FEMA claims, and we find that flood insurance coverage, we look at flood insurance coverage as well to understand more about how the physical geography of the area could impact urban heirs property owners. And it's also the physical geography of the Jacksonville Duvall area is one aspect that we look at, but we also look at Jacksonville's socio-political and historical context, which make it an important place to study urban heirs property. Heirs property has repeatedly been identified as an issue that disproportionately impacts Black landowners and attributes the loss of wealth and land itself for those families. Jacksonville has one of the highest proportional Black populations in the state of Georgia, and it was a popular Southern destination for Black migrants after emancipation. Jacksonville's Black residents made up over half the city's population in the 1890s and the first few decades of the 20th century. And like many American cities, especially in the South, Jacksonville has also had an extensive history of racially exclusionary practices that limited where Black residents could live, what jobs they could occupy, what education they could obtain, and whether and how they could vote in elections. All of these factors provide an important context within which the phenomenon of heirs property emerges in this area, and its patterns and effects impacts the residents and communities that surround it. So our study of Jacksonville heirs property seeks to understand that emergence of heirs property in this area and the effects that it is having in the community. So to the right on this slide, you can see the data sources that we use in the study, which Anne will address in more detail.
All right, thanks, Sarah. If you could go to the next slide. So one of those data sources that was listed on the previous slide is a tax assessor's database for Jacksonville or Duvall County that we use to first do our identification of heirs property and then to do some additional analysis to understand the characteristics of those properties. And so we actually started with looking at a 5-county area, which is the metro region of Jacksonville, and did a number of interviews with representatives from the tax assessor's offices in each of those 5 counties. But after those conversations, we realized that there were a number of indicators in sort of the owner name and the address fields of these tax assessor roles that indicated heirs property ownership. Things like the use of et al. Or even heirs of in the sort of owner name. But as we dug into those 5 counties, we found that really only Jacksonville had a meaningful number of heirs properties that were flagged with those indicators. So we stuck to this, core area, the Jacksonville City, Duvall County area in our analysis. And so what you see here is are the figures of how many heirs properties, very likely heirs properties, we were able to identify. This is actually likely an undercount because many heirs property owners probably don't communicate with the tax assessor's office to change the sort of contact name of an ownership of their property. So there may be a few false positives in there, but they're more likely heirs properties that are not being captured. However, we still found 29,389 heirs properties, residential heirs properties out of a total of 320,312. So that's 9.2% of all residential properties. And when we say residential properties, we mean really owner occupied residential and vacant residential properties. So we excluded multifamily rentals, group homes, things like that, that are less likely to be held as heirs property and don't have the same implications. And so this large number, that number of heirs properties also amounts to $5 billion in estimated value in housing wealth that's locked up in those ways that Sarah said and inaccessible to these families for generational wealth transfer, for economic mobility and opportunities. And some of the other kind of data points that we were able to pull from the tax assessor's data showed that these properties themselves, the heirs properties, had significantly lower just values or values that were determined by appraisers, even despite that enormous $5 billion figure, than properties that are not held as heirs properties. They tended to be older, so having an older structure, having a lower build quality of that structure, and a higher incidence of both manufactured or mobile housing as well as vacant residential land on the sites. Next slide, please, Sarah. And so we weren't able to actually find or obtain data about the individual owners of those 29,000 properties. So what we did was use Census American Community Survey data, 5-year estimates, the most recent estimates at the block group level as a proxy for the people who may be living in those properties or taking care of or owning those properties, as well as the characteristics of the communities in which they are situated. And so these are sort of quartile and decile quantile analysis of those block groups sorted by the share of residential heirs properties within those block groups. We did look at correlations, we did a simple model, but just for the purposes of kind of showing some high level results, we thought we would really draw your attention to that red bar where you see the 10th decile where the highest share of residential heirs properties exist among block groups in the Jacksonville area. And so what you can see here is quite in line with what we've seen in previous studies, particularly those rural heirs property studies that Sarah alluded to. These communities tended to have much lower average household incomes, a higher percent of the population that is Black, a higher percent of the adult population without a high school diploma, so lower educational attainment, higher vacancy rates in terms of housing vacancy, lower home ownership rates. And in the case of Jacksonville, actually, this is quite a linear relationship, but these areas tended to be lower density. So again, this really is in line with what has been previously known or anecdotally or and through empirical evidence shown about heirs properties and the communities in which they happen to concentrate. So Sarah, next slide, please. Another piece of analysis that we wanted to explore, especially given what Sarah said about the low-lying nature of this community and its really vulnerability to natural disasters, was how heirs properties themselves have been impacted by recent disasters. And so again, we were kind of forced to use block group data. We used a FEMA open source individual assistance housing claims database, but the smallest geographic identifier for that database was also the block group. So again, we're kind of thinking of this as a proxy for the types of folks who and communities in which heirs properties tend to cluster or concentrate. But what we found, again, by aggregating those claims data up to the block group and again, aggregating our heirs properties and sorting them by the share of residential heirs property by block group, was that there were some significant differences in, again, I'll draw your attention to that red bar, the communities with the highest concentration of heirs properties. And I also should mention before going through these figures that FEMA claims data based on past studies are shown to actually be skewed in that much lower resource, lower income or lower resource households tend not to seek FEMA assistance. And Sarah mentioned the difficulties in proving proof of ownership to these both FEMA, but also HUD and other organizations that provide assistance. It could be based on past experiences, but generally, even given holding constant levels of damage, lower income households are less likely to be included in this data set. And yet what we see is that among those communities with the highest concentrations of heirs property, there were materially lower percent of claims or homeowners who had home insurance or flood insurance, and yet higher shares of homeowners or claimants who yet made a claim or made a claim with serious significant damage that would require a serious repair or replacement. And we also were able to show from the self-reported income data in this data set that these claimants or homeowners also tended to be lower income. So all of this points to the fact that heirs properties in Jacksonville seem to be more vulnerable to disasters, as well as have fewer resources to rebuild in terms of insurance. And this, I should also say, is based really on 2017 data from Hurricane Irma, which was a major disaster that affected really the entire state of Florida, but was declared a major disaster in Jacksonville, which experienced historic flooding due to that event. So next slide, Sarah. And we also wanted to dig a bit into the racial exclusion that we know from past studies, from work that's been done in this space on how racial exclusion and discrimination has been a driver of the creation of heirs property over time. And we wanted to use some historical data that was pretty freely available to do this. And so you may be familiar with the redlining maps that were created in the 1930s by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. This is the map from 1937 for Jacksonville, Florida. And this system was developed to identify investment risk for lenders, especially mortgage lenders, using the presence of Black or families of color as a primary indicator of risk, which you can see in the legend, if that's legible to you. The map is clearly showing these areas that are red, which are considered high risk or D category areas, and that those areas are overlapping with households of color and non-residential land uses. We also know from past studies that the redlining maps themselves, that the practices that redlining sort of institutionalized and continued to support are measurable even today in patterns of disinvestment and racial segregation in urban areas where these maps were created. And this is just one type of de jure segregation or discrimination, one that we have readily available data for, but of course there were other types of exclusion, including racial covenants, which prevented families of color from purchasing homes from white homeowners, for example. Next slide, please, Sarah.
We have 5 minutes, Anne.
Okay, thank you. So we were then able to overlay our block group level data showing the concentration of heirs properties by block group with these Homeowners Loan Corporation redlining data. So you see the map is sort of a dot density map overlaid with the redlining on the right. And I'll point your attention back to the quantile analysis as well, where you see, again, in that red bar, among these block groups that actually were fell into the area where the redlining map had been drawn. So it's a smaller kind of subset of Jacksonville. It was pretty extraordinary, the percent of those of land area in those block groups that was redlined. So you can see 87% of these block groups with higher concentrations of heirs properties were redlined versus 43% for the area of Duvall County that also falls in that map. So again, we're really thinking of this as a practice that is well documented, that solidified and institutionalized prior racial exclusionary practices and continues to reverberate in the present and through generational impacts that include the development of heirs property in these communities. Last slide, please, Sarah. And so just a few key takeaways before we turn it over. So Jacksonville is Duvall County, an area of about 1 million residents. Yet we know that the scale of Jacksonville's heirs properties is 29,000 properties, 9% of all residential properties. And again, that figure of $5 billion in housing wealth that's locked up. So it's clear that significant resources are needed to address this issue: legal aid, estate planning, et cetera. We also believe and showed that based on our property tax records and the census overlays, that urban heirs properties do tend to share many characteristics of rural heirs properties, being in lower income, low wealth, low educational attainment, and ethnic and racial minority neighborhoods. But race in our study was by far the strongest predictor in the model, as well as in the correlations and other descriptive statistics. And so redlining was one way that we wanted to show how, these different layers of structural barriers and racial discrimination practices have added to and created more disadvantage for Black homeowners. And finally, just a research note, we were able to look at one county which took a lot of in-depth analysis and these interviews with different local representatives to better understand the data collection and sort of processes in place. But wider analysis, even in the 5-county area, is hindered very much by the lack of detailed and up-to-date and standardized data across this nation's, 3,000 odd counties. So there are issues of doing analysis like this at scale, which Robert and others can attest to as well. With that, well, thank you very much, and turn over the rest of our time.
Thank you very much, Sarah and Ann. Just about right on time, and I don't see any quick questions in the chat. I will just toss in one comment, because I can't. The 9% is big. With our research in rural Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and so on, I think the largest we've seen is 4 to 5%. So that's a big number. So it's great. All right. We will go on to our second presentation. In our second presentation is investment impacts of gendered land rights and customary land tenure systems, substantive and methodological insights from Malawi. The presenter today is Klaus Deininger, and I'll let him go ahead and introduce his co-authors.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Very good. So I think this is a study that is co-authored with my colleagues from the World Bank, Talib Pilic and Heather Moylan in the survey department, and Fang Shah from Beijing University. Of course, compared to the paper that we just have seen, I will take you to a part of the world that is quite different, to Africa, where contrary to what has been discussed here, 70 to 90% of land is held under customary and informal rights. It is, and also to where it is very clear that these informal rights perform a safety net function. They have risk coping and also cost advantages, especially at low level of population density. There is often a lack of capacity to establish the necessary registries or to maintain them. But of course, this is very clear as the land is becoming more scarce, conflict and dispossession of in disfavored group may increase, as well as privatization that may not be socially optimal. And in that context, what our paper is focusing on is another disadvantaged group, namely women, who may lose out by this process. I think, and of course, the motivation for our paper is that there is very little known about what the impact of such changes is, even though there's a lot of interest in the literature in formalization. But there's also a lot of anecdotal evidence on land disputes actually increasing and often emerging around dispossession of females in the context of inheritance or bequest that is associated with inheritance. that is likely to affect both productivity through the investment land transfer channel. But as I said, there's very little known, and but also affecting, of course, equity, because it is clear that women's bargaining power and outside options clearly depend on whether they have secure land rights or not. How that matters, and of course, what how to go about that depends first of all in terms on getting good information and data on that, and that is where our study aims to contribute. Just to add that in the context of Malawi, this is a particularly important issue. In another paper that we show that about 22% of households in Malawi indicate that they have insecure rights. If we look at females and actually look at the productivity impact of that, that is about 12, females' productivity is about 12 percentage points lower. And giving a monetary value to that, it adds up to about $14 million per year in terms of productivity losses. However, what we are aiming to start to do is to close the methodology gap by assessing the measurement error and the respondent bias that has contributed to much of the literature not finding a lot of significant impacts, by looking at two surveys that have been conducted in parallel in Malawi. One of them with exactly identical questionnaires, but one asking respondents directly and one asking the most knowledgeable household, most knowledgeable individual in the household, which is the standard practice. And by comparing these estimates, we see, I think we hope to contribute to the literature and show that careful data collection really matters. This paper contributes, therefore, to three strands of the literature. The first one is on female empowerment and under customary institutions. Clearly, a lot of papers have shown that land is a key asset for women, that affects their bargaining power and their human capital investments. Also that efforts at formalization, for example, in Ethiopia and Rwanda, have had significant impact on improving investment incentives for females, especially female-headed households and female landowners, but nobody has actually looked at also, I think, in Zambia, very interesting JDE paper by Dillon and Werner shows that women's inheritance rights at the village level affects productivity and investment in customary systems, because of course, if women are not able to bequeath the land that they are cultivating, they will have less incentive to invest in both fertilizer use and longer-term soil improvements. But of course, much of the literature on gendered land rights is quite inconclusive, and we think that that may be part of the reason, maybe the survey methodology, because as I already alluded to, the standard approach in household surveys is to ask what is called the proxy respondent. That means the most knowledgeable person in the household, rather than the landowner individually. And of course, that may be appropriate for formal rights, where you have a document that you can check whether the name of the female is actually there or not. But it may be quite inappropriate for informal rights under customary arrangements, which is the setting that we are talking about here. There are some studies that actually support the notion that this can be relevant. And of course, I think inheritance can be particularly contentious and important, because it is actually compared to management rights that are only for the short term, it is something that really affects your long-term outcomes. There are, and of course, the third area of the literature that we contribute to is to look at mechanisms to secure rights and their impact. Traditionally, there's of course a very large literature on formalization, but awarding title is very costly and a lengthy process, and most of the African countries including Rwanda, which has implemented a very famous land regularization program, lack the capacity to actually keep maintain the formal registries that they have been establishing. Therefore, and I think studies in Benin, for example, show that even if you formalize, of course, it's very important what is the underlying informal structures and how do you deal with that. Also, compared to that, I think changes in women's inheritance rights via the family law can be relatively quick and low cost in comparison. They can complement or they may be needed to complement any effects or any impacts of formalization in any case, which I think is shown by a study by Kumar and Kisumbing in Ethiopia, and also Plateau has a couple of papers there. So whether and how women's rights in inheritance rights in customary settings affect outcomes is actually quite important to know. Malawi provides a unique context for studying this question. It is a very densely populated country that is very vulnerable to climate change. I think according to a number of studies, it is one of the countries that will be most negatively affected by climate change globally. It is dominated by smallholders, but has the 25% under estates. And it is with increasing land scarcity, conflicts are really becoming much more important, as I indicated already earlier. It is also very interesting because matrilineal and patrilineal tenure systems coexist. And of course, these by themselves can have significant impact on women's outside options. And because as a recent study by Sarah Loebs shows that matrilineal inheritance systems, by increasing the outside options, matrilineal tenure systems, of course, by increasing the outside options of women, can reduce domestic violence. Another paper also shows that this can result in higher education of kids and more different spending in terms of consumption expenditure at a household level. In patrilineal systems, women are much more vulnerable in climate shocks, as shown by another study. And of course, matrilineal systems there has been quite a debate in the literature on whether these matrilineal systems by divergence lead to lower investment in commercialization and land attached investments, because commercialization is mostly is closely related to social status, which is the and of course men have higher social status and better access to outside markets. It is all Malawi is also interesting because a new land law was passed in 2016, and that recognizes customary tenure and mandates gender equality, but it doesn't really operationalize it. So with that motivation, let's go into the methodological issues. As I mentioned, we have a survey experiment where we have two identical surveys that were administered in parallel. The first one in 2016-17. The first one is the Integrated Household Survey 4. So it's the fourth round with about 12,000 households. It uses the proxy respondent, and the second one, a much smaller panel survey, asked every member in the household about their land rights individually. In order to apply household fixed effects, we focus on agricultural parcels only, because there are multiple agricultural parcels in the household, but not multiple residential parcels. Of course, we are interested in what type of rights matter, and as I alluded to earlier, inheritance or the ability to bequeath rights is one of our main candidates rather than short-term rights, but of course we test the short-term rights, and we use two types of outcome variables. One is manure application and the second one is cash crop cultivation. Manure application, of course, there's a large literature that has used that, including in Africa. It increases soil carbon. Similar to fallow, it's not visible, so I think the potential for reverse causality is reduced, and I think it's something that is a clear indication of investment. Cash crop cultivation, I think, needs both secure tenure and market access, and it may something where the social structure in Malawi may actually give men an advantage. Just to give you some indication on the data that we have, This is, as you see, the level of formal rights is very limited. Only 2% in our sample have formal rights. About 25% apply organic manure. In terms of descriptive statistics, I think the only thing that you need to take away from this table is that women, so the top one is the IHPS, which is the one that was direct elicitation. The bottom one is the one where proxy respondents have answered. And what is emerges here is that if in the indirect response, which is the business as usual case, women lack men in all rights, male ownership rights are overstated generally. And if that is co-ownership, then I think female rights are actually a little bit enhanced. So I think just in terms of overall descriptive statistics, not very much that we can conclude. So of course we need to go to an econometric approach. We have three different specifications. The first one is essentially simply at the household level. We use household fixed effects. We have a very extensive vector of land characteristics, soil quality, slope, and other characteristics, including interaction with differences in gender tenure. And we then have the first regression is at the household level. Second regression is where we interact the rights with the right holder. So we distinguish between rights held by males and female, a different type of rights. And the third one is where we interact this with the inheritance regime. To show you for, the result, I think the first one is at the household level. Our two outcome variables are, and I think we include parcel characteristics as well as labor days. And what we find is that there is a very clear, seems to be a clear impact of bequest and sales rights on the application of manure, but much less on the planting of cash crops. If we distinguish this by women's and men's right, actually we see some interesting difference emerge. The bequest, the right for females is very significant throughout in terms of application of organic manure, but has no impact on planting of cash crops, but the opposite emerges. The bequest rights for men is actually quite significant for planting of cash crops. If we do adding then the interactions with matrilineal and patrilineal tenure systems, we find, I think we didn't do the interactions for the first one, but that is available in the paper. And I think the results do not change. I think this is what I showed you already earlier, but what is interesting is that in non-matrilineal communities, where the right to bequeath is less relevant, the right to sell for women also becomes quite important for organic manure application. And of course, the cash crop planting for men stays consistent. If we now compare our results to the business as usual approach, we see very clearly that, or quite surprisingly, that even though the sample in the IHS for the business as usual whole survey is more than 5 times as large as the panel survey, the differences, we don't see any significant differences. We see very clear impact of women's right to bequeath and men's right to bequeath on organic manure, but we don't see any effect if we use the IHS, the traditional household survey, which suggests that the methodology of data collection and asking the owners directly rather than proxies, as has been the standard approach, is quite important. The same thing happens if we look at the cash crop planted. We actually see some perverse effects of a negative effect. So I think, sorry, the two columns here is, so IHS4 is the whole sample. In IHS4 restricted, we only use the the cases where the respondent is actually a co-owner of the parcel or indicates to be a co-owner of the parcel, to make sure that we don't include, or that the measurement error that could be associated with the fact that somebody who is not a co-owner gives erroneous information on who else owns the land. But clearly the effect is negative, and 10% or 5% significant in both of these cases. So clearly the way in which the data are collected matters quite a bit. And I think we have the same results here, nothing significant in terms of if we use the business as usual approach. So what does this mean in terms of overall conclusion and next steps? Clearly, as I mentioned, data collection methodology seems to be very important to make inferences on rights of women and men in customary settings. This is, of course, very even much more important than in formalized settings in a customary environment where nothing is written down and you need to really so cross-checking against documents is not possible. The IHS does not produce any significant results, even though the sample is much larger. So clearly this measurement error is not very classical. And this may explain the lack of results and the lack of impact of women's rights in many other studies. Second, gender differentiated sale and bequest, even though short-term rights don't really seem to matter a lot. Bequest and to some extent sales rights, especially in settings where the tenure regime is not matrilineal, seem to be mattering a lot, and the size and the so I think you saw the effect sizes were about 15 percentage points, which is comparable to, which is quite large, and which is comparable to what is attributed in other studies to the effect of titling. And so clearly this matters not only statistically but also economically, because if by just increasing women's rights, and of course one can discuss different methodologies and approaches for actually doing that, one can get effect sizes that are similar to what can be achieved by titling, which is a very costly, complex, and cumbersome process that takes a long time. That clearly can be a promising approach and something that can be pursued for further. On the contrary, at the same time, of course, it is very important also to note that protecting women's rights from erosion that may be inevitable as land becomes more scarce and conflicts about land increase. And we have a lot of examples from Africa where weaker groups are the first ones to lose out in that process will be very important. And therefore, I think that is also something where following up in terms of future surveys, measuring women's rights directly rather than through indirect proxies is very important to get an accurate picture of who has the ownership rights and or who has what type of rights, and to be able to actually see how changes affect productivity outcomes in the longer term. And of course, that will be something that also will be interesting to check in other countries to see whether the results that we are observing here are in some way related to the matrilineal and patrilineal tenure systems that are quite unique to Malawi, or whether they can be generalized to other countries. But clearly, we think that focusing on inheritance rights, even under customary settings, is a very important research and policy question. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Klaus. And under time. And I don't see any questions in the chat box. So we'll go ahead and go to our final presentation. And that is the influence of the land titling policy on land abandonment in China. And the major speaker will be Krishna Padel. And if Krishna, if you go ahead and introduce your co-authors.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Let's see, you can see full screen or full screen, yes. So I'm Krishna Paudel with USDA ERS, and my co-authors are Kai Liu, Minjiang Luo, and Wenji Zhou. Before I proceed with my presentation, I would like to mention that the findings and conclusions in these presentations are those of the authors and should not be construed to represent any official USDA or US government determination or policy. So my presentation outline this morning, I'm going to talk about land abandonment situation in China. And China has just recently, meaning 2013, implemented land titling policy. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And how does the land titling policy affect land abandonment? So I'll talk about that. Then I will introduce data and some modeling approach. And my results would be the next, and I will conclude with the findings. So in China, rural land abandonment rate was as high as 9.43% in 2014. That one is 1 year before the nationally implemented land titling policy. But after land titling policy implementation, the abandonment rate has gone down to 3.27% based on China Labor Force Dynamics Survey stat. So here, when I talk about land abandonment, I mean land fallowing. It is possible that farmers may plant trees instead of planting crops in regular cropland, but primarily I'm saying that it is left fallow. So what causes rural land abandonment? There are two main reasons. One is land fragmentation and low income from farming. China has collective assigned farmland area, and the land assigned in average is about 0.23 hectares, which comes out to be in their local unit, they measure it in mu, and so it's about 3 mu or so. And based on the income of this 0.23 hectare, farming income is estimated about 17, close to $18 per month. And also, if you look at their land allocation, it's not only one kind of land. It is mixed, good land, for example, for paddy rice cultivation, and also they have more hilly type of land and some land where you cannot irrigate. So these plots are scattered, and they are of various categories. Another reason for land abandonment is really, this one is big one because of urban work opportunities and high income. If you look at China, large number of people migrate from rural areas to urban area, and these are temporary migrants because of their hukou system, where just because you go and work in urban areas, you cannot permanently get hukou which is, rights to stay in urban area. And generally these workers go to urban area or, sometimes for many, many years and sometimes just within a year, but they come back during Spring Festival or in some cases, maybe even if they're close enough, they come back during harvesting and planting time. But if they are far enough, that's not possible. And if you look at the income, income is several-fold higher in urban areas. And so there is incentive for these people to move to urban areas. And so what that does is that leaves women and elderly as labor force in rural areas. And of course, that may also mean that they will not have sufficient labor to farm, and so they abandon the land. So if we look at land titling in China, before the land titling, the community or the collectives had the power. They would allocate the land and they would reallocate within certain time period, generally 3 to 5 years, but it can be a little bit longer. And households had rights to use or rent out or make profit. So if household rents out land, generally it is perceived that either they do not have sufficient amount of labor or that they are not interested in farming. And so the next time around when land reallocation happens, then they may lose that land. So the abandonment happens because of really two main reasons. One is insecurity in renting out. If they transfer, they may lose the land. Transfer, I use the word transfer out also. It's the same as renting out. And also, if it is not profitable for them to cultivate the land, they may leave it fallow or they may abandon the land. So for a theoretical model, it's a simple theoretical model, but it was in detail in the paper. And if you're interested, I can share the paper with you. So I have these different variables, and I'm gonna just briefly talk about the theoretical model here. This is income. Why is the income of the household? And this is income from farming on own. Okay, so this is self-cultivation, and this is the investment that a farmer does on his own cultivated land. And this is the because of no land titling and frequent relocation and reallocation of the land, there is a risk of losing investment. If you invest, say, for example, irrigation or land improvement, next time around, you may not have that land. So there is that risk. Farm household can earn rent. This is transfer land, and this is the rental income. But they may lose that land if it is perceived that the household do not need that land because they are renting it out. And I have a couple of constants here. This is the total amount of land, and this is self-cultivated, transfer, and abandoned. And there is a risk of investment loss, and that depends on collectives land endowment, as well as the individual ability and the land titling. And also for the transfer land, the risk of losing the transfer land depends on this same thing. And the value of land, if you have no transfer land, then you're not getting any value from the land. So from the transfer land. And so after I do algebraic manipulation, I go in detail in the paper, but this algebraic manipulation shows that the relationship between investment and income depends on the risk of losing the transfer land, and this one is determined by RS here, and so this relationship shows how having land title or not land title would affect investment and total income of farm household. So here I just show one figure, the higher risk. If there is a higher risk, this one is higher risk. The investment is lower, okay? And if there is lower risk, generally farmers invest on their cultivated land a little bit higher. And so this is a graphical representation of same derivation that I showed you earlier. I have a more elaborate description in the paper. So here, if you look at before the land titling, the government has the law, and the community has the community or the collectives have the ownership right, and farmers had the rights to use, rent out, or make profit. And this is after the land titling. And here, households land right, they have right to use, right to rent out, right to profit, and even right of inheritance. And the community has really very minimum, ownership right here. And so after the land titling, what happens is relocation for household would no longer happen. The risk factor that I mentioned earlier would not happen, and household may rent out their land without reallocation worries. So what we hypothesize here is the land titling policy can improve land rent out and reduce land abandonment. So to test our hypothesis, we, my colleagues at South Sinai University, South Sinai Ag University, collected data from 9 Chinese provinces. The one I have shown here on yellow highlight here, these are the provinces. My colleagues are located here in Guangdong province, excuse me, nearby Hong Kong. So some of you not familiar with China. And one of the things that we do in this paper is we cluster because of all these different locations around the country. So we wanted to find out the homogeneous kind of observation. So we cluster it, and the clustering is commonly used in marketing literature, price discrimination, and consumer segmentation. The clustering approach that I use is a little bit different. We call this one model-based clustering, and it assumes that the data come from a distribution that is mixture of 2 or more clusters, and it uses soft assignment that each data point has a probability of belonging to each cluster. So the model-based clustering approach groups total observations into these 4 different clusters. The cluster 1 has what we call with less social capital. China has in some villages, if you go, there may be all households with same last name. So this particular one village that we looked at has 90% of residents with the last name Liu, and it happens to be my co-authors, one of my co-authors' last name also. So if you have this small name, meaning like you don't have very many people with the same last name, we call that one the cluster with lower social capital. And then cluster 2 has a large number of people with same last name. So that one is more strong, social capital village. And also the reallocation of land in these 2 clusters, we saw that there were not frequent reallocation. In fact, like in last 5 years, there was no reallocation. And then in cluster 3, we have a very few observations, and there we have 139 observations, and this particular cluster has extra frequent reallocation. In fact, we saw that reallocation was 2.3 times in recent 5 years. In cluster 4 also has frequent reallocation, but not as often as in cluster 3. So one of the concerns that we have here is cluster 3 does not have sufficient number of observations for the model that we're estimating. So I'm going to show you only results from cluster 1, 2, and 4. You can estimate a parametric model, but when we go to semi-parametric and non-parametric type of model would be hard to estimate with 139 observations. So the model that I mentioned to you that we estimate is a fractional. This is seemingly unrelated kind of fractional model. The original idea is, of course, Papke and Ulrich, I think 1996 paper. That one is parametric one, and also looking at only one dependent variable. We have 3 dependent variables here, so we estimate seemingly fractional regression in seemingly unrelated specification model, okay? And so here, the total land is divided into 3 different dependent variables here. This is fraction again, the rate of farmland renting out, and then the total land, abandoned land divided by the total land. That's another dependent variable, and the third dependent variable is the rate of farmland self-cultivation. Again, these are all between 0 and 1, and they add up to 1 when you add the fraction for each individual farmer. And the variable of interest here is the land titling policy. If household has land title and 0 otherwise. And we have several human capital characteristics. For example, if household laborers work off farm, or if they have high school education. And then also we have social capital characteristics, as I mentioned to you earlier. If they have a same type of last name, then the village has high social capital, or the individual has high social capital. We have farmland characteristics, which is number of parcels of land divided by total land. And then we also have economic characteristics, income and village level characteristics, the distance to driving distance or walking distance to driving to county center or town center. And then also we look at the times of partial adjustment of farmland within 5 years in the village. So here
you have 5 minutes, Krishna.
Okay. So here I look at, so we look at this thing. This is looking at the land effect of land titling. And if you look at the cluster 1 with low social capital, land titling reduces this negative value, reduces abandonment by 2.8%, and increases land transfer by 4.4%. And if you go to cluster 2 with high social capital, you can see that land abandonment is slightly less than low social capital, 2.6%, but the transfer is higher here. And then cluster 4 is where we had more frequent land reallocation, and there land titling reduces land abandonment by as much as 6%, 6.2%. This one is a fraction model, so a fraction parametric model. We wanted to see the specification is a major concern in this kind of models. So we wanted to see if we can estimate the same thing with parametric and semi-parametric model. Semi-parametric model is less prone to curse of dimensionality. So we estimate semi-parametric model, which means some of the variables enter in the model in a parametric fashion, whereas some other variables enter in non-parametric fashion. But to identify which one enters in what way, we have to use non-parametric model. And so here, this table shows which one enters as non-parametrical in the model. So, so some of these things that I have shown here, I'll show you pictures also. Also, we tested these models for whether semi-parametric model is better than parametric model, or non-parametric model is better than parametric model. In all cases, we found out that non-parametric or semi-parametric model, except in this self-cultivation transfer land in cluster 2, we see that that's not significant. But as I mentioned to you earlier, because of curse of dimensionality problem, we go ahead and estimate the semi-parametric model. And so here I would just like to mention that this one is a semi-parametric model, and the effect is a little bit, different than what we saw in parametric model. Land abandonment in here decreases with land titling, in cluster 1 by 3.1%. In cluster 2 with high social capital, a little bit less, 2.9. But if there is unstable property right, meaning there is frequent reallocation of land, then abandonment really reduces with land titling, and the percentage value is as high as 8.2%. And if we look at the household non-farm worker, if there are more non-farm working adults in the household, abandonment increases substantially, and this is true in all clusters, but more so in case of cluster 4, which is, as I mentioned earlier, is the one with unstable property right. And another one that I would like to mention is land fragmentation. In some cases, the land fragmentation decreases this transfer, and this is significant in case of 1 and 2. But in some cases, I have left this blank because those models are estimated using the variables, the relationship of the variable with land abandonment is estimated using non-parametric models. So non-parametric, the variable interest non-parametrically. So if you look at here, the land fragmentation and land abandonment in cluster 1.
Krishna, you're about out of time, so go ahead.
Okay, all right. So I would wrap up here. Again, like the relationship is not the same in case of here fragmentation reduces, but the relationship is inverted U-shape. So to summarize, land titling policies significantly reduce land abandonment rate by 2.9 to 3.1%. And if it can be as high as 8.2%. In case of non-farm employment, it increases land abandonment, and it can be as high as 20%. Extremely fragmented land reduces land abandonment, as you can see from that curve that I showed you. But if the land property rights were unsecured, the fragmented lands had a higher probability of abandonment, and the distance to business center has positive effect on land abandonment rate because of the high transaction cost. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Krishna. Okay, now we are to the point, after having the presentations, to listen to Michael Carter, who is our discussant. Michael, it's all yours.
Okay, so please, if my slides don't advance, let me know, please. So thank you, everybody. I use my boilerplate PowerPoint here, and I usually put a beautiful picture. And there was only one beautiful picture in the three set of slides. So I'm showing you Jacksonville, Florida. And I went to 4th grade just over here, just on the edge of the map. So this has a little bit of a connection for me personally. So, oops. Let me see what's going on here. Okay. So this is a really interesting grouping of paper on very disparate situations. When I first thought about being a discussant, I said, how can I tie these papers together? Mostly you'll see I give up on tying them together, but I do want to mention a few things that I'll touch on briefly as I offer my comments on the interesting comments on these papers as we move along. But some of the things that maybe do tie them together, or where the papers might learn from each other, I list here. So one of them, the Malawi study that Klaus presented, talks a lot about investment incentives. So interestingly, I found that element missing in the Jacksonville study that Sarah and Ann presented to us. So they talk a lot about, for example, that heirs property may be undervalued, but there's less discussion about maybe that's an endogenous reaction to the fact that inheritance rules are messy and maybe people are under incentivized to invest in them. So that's something to kind of think about. The other thing that sort of popped out at me as I read these papers as a group is both the China study, which Krishna just presented to us, as well as the Sarah and Ann study on Florida, both actually have a little bit going on there about land abandonment. Sarah and Ann didn't really emphasize it a lot, but they do show that heirs property has a much higher vacancy rate. So there seems to be some element going on there of land abandonment. I suspect it's rather different economics. But again, some of the concerns that come from literature on land titling in other parts of the world do seem to have some resonance with the US situation. The other thought I had as I was reading through these is Klaus's study, the Malawi study, is very interesting because they're trying to drill down into what are the exact rights that people perceive that they have in land. I think it would be really interesting to kind of ask ourselves, how would the occupants of heirs land in Florida respond to the kinds of questions that were in the survey that Klaus presented to us? Would a person who occupies heirs land, would they say that they can't transact it, that they can't do this, can't do that? I think it would be really interesting to think about that just a little bit more. And also perhaps think about, and I'll come back to this a little bit when discussing the Malawi paper, about how the response in Malawi that we get may be endogenous to characteristics of the owner and the occupants. That is, the way they report their rights may reflect something about the individual. And this is something Klaus briefly mentioned when he said there, men may seem to be over-reporting, perhaps unsurprisingly, the rights that they have. So anyway, let me jump into the papers themselves. So I went in alphabetical order because I was not actually sure what the order of presentation was going to be. So the paper Klaus presented to us on land transfer rights and inheritance rights in Malawi, I think has a number of really interesting messages in there. I really like the way they've structured this paper. And I think one point that Klaus mentioned briefly, but it's one really worth investigating, given the expense of actually doing land titling formalization, the notion that a family law change is the sort, as was taking place in Malawi at the time of their studies, potentially a really cost-effective way to improve the power and the situation of women. And I think that's an element that is really important in this paper. So I want to offer Klaus and his co-author some comments that I hope they'll find useful as they continue to work on this paper. So I'm going to talk about really 4 different issues. First, is cash crop adoption really a long-term investment? This is something that occurred to me as I talked about it. I want to say a little bit about the identifying variation that they use to actually say what the impacts of tenure are. I want to talk a little bit about what I'm going to call the imbalances in their survey experiment. And finally, make a suggestion that there's perhaps a little more to learn if we look just at households that have a single household head. So first of all, let's talk about this first issue. So is cash crop adoption really a long-term investment? The paper does a very thorough job in convincing us that organic manure is a long-lived investment and that we might expect its investment intensity to be affected by transfer rights. And there's a very interesting observation that Klaus made that manure is a less observable by an outsider investment, and therefore the stuff JD paper from the early 2000s suggests that people invest in order to improve security, that the manure application is not likely to be subject to that criticism. But I found the paper much less convincing, or at least my own reflection, about cash crop adoption. So the cash crops that are being discussed are tobacco, sugarcane, cotton, and peppers. The paper makes a really nice point that growing these crops requires building market relationships, and that men seem to be socially advantaged in building those market relationships, and hence we might indeed be looking at male property rights when it comes to impacts on these cash crop cultivations. But where I struggled was whether this is really a long-term investment that should be influenced by inheritance and transfer rights. So unless the market relationships that you need to grow, say, peppers, and I believe these are not black pepper like a tree crop, but is actually a red pepper. I think that's what's grown in Malawi. Unless these market relationships are really durable and expensive to set up, it's hard to see why my inability to share or bequeath my land should influence my decision to grow these crops. And indeed, if I die and I've built up a relationship with a trader or I move away, it's not clear why transfer rights should really matter for this, because how can I transfer a personal relationship that I might have, a durable personal relationship I might have with a trader? So if I sort of overstate the criticism a little bit, this almost felt a little bit like a placebo test to me. It's not, the paper doesn't present it that way. I mean, why should transfer rights influence cash crop cultivation? I suspect Klaus and his colleagues could suggest this, but another alternative explanation is maybe this is a male bravado effect. So men who grow crash shops are perhaps overstating their rights on land because they become sort of more integrated into markets and sort of are overstating their powers. And that, again, touches back a little bit on my comment on how does this kind of self-reporting on tenure status, how might that play out if we ask occupants of heirs property in Jacksonville? A little bit of a second point I'd like to make, which I hope is helpful for the authors in thinking about this, is to think a little bit more about the identifying variation that's being used in this paper to say what the effects of tenure are. So as Klaus showed us, the paper uses a standard fixed effects kind of approach. So the subscript notation here is important. I is the parcel, J is the household. So that's the general, and this is their second model that I put up here. The fixed effects, the household fixed effect alpha J is really important because it controls for all sorts of things that are constant across plots, but may actually influence proclivity to make investments. So that could be things like credit access or risk aversion. So the fixed effect is really important here, I think, to the credibility of the identification strategy. But as the third bullet point writes down, we know we can rewrite the fixed effect model here as we can sweep away the fixed effect by replacing with this transformation. So what's going to identify, say, beta 1 here is RFIJ minus R bar FJ, where R bar FJ is, say, the average level of female rights across the different plots that a household has. And RFIJ is the level of female plots. So what the fixed effect is, how it's going to identify the impact of, say, female transfer rights on investments is sort of intra-house within the household deviation differences in plots. So as the fourth bullet point says, note that this deviation RFIJ minus R bar FJ, that's going to equal 0 for any household that has only one plot. And if you look at the descriptive statistics here, in one data set, about the average number of plots is about 1.4 per household, which suggests roughly that about 60% of the households only have one plot. So this term is going to be 0 for at least 60% of the observations. And notice it's also going to equal 0 even for households that have more than one plot, but if they have the same property rights across all plots. So for example, if women have bequeathal rights on all the plots in the household, then RFIJ minus R bar FJ will just also be 0. So it's only going to be a tiny subset. It's only going to be a tiny subset of the not tiny, a smallish subset of the observations that's actually going to be identifying the beta 1 and the beta 2 that we're really interested in. So I think number one, in terms of understanding what's going on in terms of statistical estimation, it would be really good to help us understand the structure of the data at this level. The next point here is for those households for whom this term is not 0 and therefore who are identifying it. These are households that, number one, have more than one plot, and they also have variation across plots in the property rights. Now, is that a standard situation? Is that an unusual situation? I don't really know, but I think we need to learn a little bit more about where the variation is coming from. So that's sort of one point I think to think about. And a side point here is the one part that's really interesting about this paper is that it has this sort of quasi-experiment in terms of comparing two different data sets. And Klaus said quite nicely in his presentation that one data set is much larger than the other, but perhaps that data set's not actually larger if you actually look at the amount of identifying variation. So for example, the larger data set actually has a smaller fraction of households that have more than one plot. So from the get-go, we know that there may be less identifying variation in the larger data set. So it's possible from an identification perspective that that larger data set maybe actually has less variation in it, and maybe that's part of the explanation that we find no impacts using that data set where the proxy responding gives households. Another comment, excuse me, sorry, I haven't had a chance to talk yet this morning since it's still early here. Another comment I would like to make is I really like the spirit of this more expensive survey methodology that asks each individual to report their property rights. And it's interesting to call this an experiment in survey design, but if we have to sort of ask ourselves if we want to treat it as an experiment, is it a very well-designed experiment? So if this was actually an RCT, the first thing we would do is look at a balance table. And I've just grabbed something from table 1, and there's a lot of questions in that regard. So for example, the expensive survey has 26% female-headed households. The other one has 31%. The more expensive survey has wealthier households. It has households with more parcels, with more agricultural land, et cetera. So from a survey, from a RCT perspective or quasi-experimental perspective, this is not a very well-balanced survey design. So I think we would need to sort of look at these differences a little more carefully, maybe consider a matching method if these imbalance problems are significant. And again, these imbalance problems are becoming because these are not surveys given to the same household. Each survey had its own sample frame, its own clustering, et cetera. So I think if we thought about this from an RCT perspective, we might gain some additional, an imperfect RCT perspective, we might gain some additional thoughts about how to approach this system. So those are some comments on the first paper. And turning now to the paper on China that Krishna presented to us. So we see that what this paper shows us that in the context of the Chinese economy with really rapid rural outmigration, households that received the land titling policy transformation earlier tend to leave their land less abandoned, and they tend to transfer the land of other farmers more. So this is, farmland consolidation, as most of us on this call probably know, is a big issue in China. And so this is really a welcome and interesting study. My concerns I want to share with you and suggestions for the authors have to do in the first instance with what you might call endogenous program placement. And I think also, again, looking at the overall balance between locations with and without the land titling program, and also within the empirically identified clusters of similar observations. And finally, I'd like to suggest the paper could maybe be strengthened if it did a little more conceptual work on the clusters, which at this stage of the paper, it's sort of presented. They're presented as sort of empirical factoids that emerged from unsupervised learning algorithm. So first on what I think is maybe the most important issue, endogenous program placement. As the paper tells us, the land titling policy was piloted in 2008 and then was rolled out nationwide, but localities were given the 2013, if I understood right, 2013 to 2018 period in order to actually carry out and implement it. The survey was carried out in 2015-16, so it's in the middle of implementation. Now the paper assumes that the implementation was as good as random, meaning each locality actually decided where they're going to introduce the land titling policy first. Now that's a very strong assumption, and I think the paper needs to work a little harder to convince us that this is true. So if I go back to a paper I wrote many years ago with Yao Yang and Li Shu Ying and in World Development. We were looking at an earlier set of reforms, and we suggested there were some really systematic political economy reasons about where reforms were implemented and the sequence of those reforms. That is, we might anticipate that transfer rights would be implemented in places where labor outmigration is strongest and where the cost of that labor outmigration in terms of land abandonment is most severe. So we had that kind of, I'm going to call that endogenous program placement. If we have that kind of endogenous program placement problem going on, the empirical results we see may be overstating the average impacts that will actually come from the land titling policy program. So I think, I'm sure the authors can think of other instances, but in terms of the credibility of the estimates as a representation of the impact of the program, I think that's an issue that requires some attention. Again, if we sort of continue thinking about the identification approach in this paper, again, it's mostly assuming that assignment to treatment, meaning pre-survey treatment with the land titling program, it's thinking of that as being exogenous. So if that's the case, we could actually look at the characteristics of places that were treated pre-survey and those that were not treated pre-survey. So we could sort of look at, it'd be nice to look at that and see, in fact, does it appear to be balanced? Or is the suggestion in this earlier World Development paper that I mentioned that actually programs were probably implemented with sort of a political economic logic? We need to sort of look at that and can we identify what's going on there a little more structurally. We could ask a similar kind of question about the clusters. As far as I could tell from the paper, the clustering algorithm actually uses the land titling policy treatment as one of the variables that on which clusters are identified. That seems a little bit worrisome to me because that would seem to sort of clump together in these different treatments, you know, might create some imbalance in terms of in these different clusters, how many are treated, how many are not treated with the early land titling policies. The final point I'd like to make here then is, again, the clustering, I think it's a really innovative and interesting approach. One of the results in it makes a lot of sense in terms of the identified impact. But for me, at least, I'd want to think about it a little more structurally. I'd like to have sort of a sharper theoretical perspective on which variables are being included and why. So in earlier work, another paper, one of my favorite unpublished, never published papers, also with Yang Yao, that we wrote, a paper called Specialization Without Regret. In that paper, we said, you know, we were looking at land transfer rights and we said, these are going to be really important in areas where there's a very high probability of labor outmigration. And in fact, we show that taking that variable into account has a large impact in terms of identifying the impact of land transfer rights on investment behavior. So I think the encouragement here would be that the authors think not only about an empiricist method for identifying clusters, but also think a little bit structurally about the economics of the problem. So I hope that's a helpful set of comments for that paper. Oh, and let me just emphasize this last point before I run out of time here. We do see that land transfer policy decreases land endowment and has an even larger effect on land transfers. It'd be good to sort of discuss that. So if I have insecure property rights, this seems to suggest that it's safer to me to abandon the land. There's some chance I can come back and reclaim it than if I transfer it and rent it out to somebody. Now, I think there's probably a rationale for that, but it would be good to have it brought into the paper. Okay, so now going to the Stein and Carpenter paper on Jacksonville. So this paper in many ways is descriptive, but it's a very interesting descriptive paper because it's pointing us towards what I've called here a vicious circle in which tenure insecurity, which comes from heirs property, may reinforce low living standards of the occupants because they have trouble accessing credit. They have trouble getting insurance, et cetera. So sort of let's call that a vicious circle that could happen here. And the paper hints at a hefty public finance and maybe social cost that might emanate from this situation. So I found this paper very interesting to read and think about. But my comments here are gonna be a couple. The first is, be interesting in more comparative perspective to know a bit more about the severity of the problem of land loss. The second comment is going to be, is underinvestment because of insecure tenure, is that actually the source of depressed property values? And finally, and what I find most intriguing about this paper is what it might tell us about the endogeneity of heirs property to redlining. So let me quickly say a little bit about that. So if we look back to the paper on China that Krishna presented to us, they identified one cluster where they said tenure and security is the greatest because there'd been at least one land reallocation within the 5 years preceding the survey. Now I'm kind of curious, the heirs paper tells us there is tenure and security and people can be forced to engage in unfavorable sales of the property. But I wonder, is there a way to sort of measure that or understand what the severity of that insecurity really is when it comes to heirs property? And you know, the 1 in 5 years reallocation in China and some of the work on China, because those reallocations were quite publicly visible, you could measure that. But would it actually be possible to gauge the severity? What's the risk a person who has heirs property? If I'm an occupant of my great-grandmother's house, what's the probability that I'll actually be dispossessed and get only, you know, 1/24 of the value of the property? I know Klaus is familiar with the Prindex work, which is a project that's trying to work on tenure and security globally. I don't remember the kinds of questions they use, but my guess is that they have some ways of looking at gauging the severity of this kind of insecurity. And a lot of the Prindex work is actually focused on urban areas. So that could be an interesting place to look for some ideas on how to measure tenure and security. Again, as I think I already hinted at this, but the paper that Klaus presented to us is very much in the mainstream of a lot of work in development economics on tenure and security, in that it focuses on the ways in which the insecurity associated with something like heirs property might undercut investment incentives. So in the case of the Jacksonville study, are the investment incentives, is the tenure and security great enough that if I live in my grandmother's house, I'm not going to improve it, I'm not going to maintain it, and it sort of goes down. One thing I thought the paper might talk about, or maybe an area for future research, is clearly there could be some spillover externality effects. So if I live in a neighborhood and there's a modest association of heirs property, if those of us in heirs property are not maintaining our property, we start to depress the value of property within the whole community, even those people that have non-heirs property. And so you may create a spillover kind of vicious circle. So again, I think it would be interesting to sort of think about whether the depressed value of heirs property, is it really because of a limited market to sell, or is it because the insecurity itself has undercut the incentives to sustain investment and to maintain properties? I think that's certainly something where the development economics work, such as that Klaus shared with us, has a lot to say. So the final comment I want to make then has to do with the endogeneity of heirs property. So the way, I know some of the first work I ever did on tenure and security was in the country of Kenya. And one of the problems in Kenya, there was land titling, but you know, within a generation, the property registries became outdated because inheritance had taken place, transactions had taken place, and nobody bothered to update the land registry. Okay, and the standard argument that we used to tell ourselves is that the problem is the reason the registries become outdated, in a sense, people were choosing to turn their what had been titled property into heirs property, is because no one saw any value to clearly registering their property rights. Like, why bother? So some work I did with someone named Pedro Olinto a few years back in Paraguay, we were sort of looking at the impact of land titling on access to capital. And part of that paper is sort of saying, the impact of land titling depends a lot on whether or not having a land title allows you to leverage access to capital. Now, if we connect that kind of thinking with the Jacksonville story, I think we have the potential here for something that's really interesting and probably really important, right? So if I'm a member of a community that's been redlined, okay, if I'm in a redline community, why would I bother? Why would I bother to buy out my heirs? Why would I bother to try to really clarify the property rights? Because it's not going to give me anything. You know, the lenders won't lend to me anyway. So one of the primary incentives for doing it, for registering and sort of uncomplicating the title would be that. And so I think there's a direct reflection there to some of the work we've seen in development economics, where property registries are often not maintained because there is no real incentive to do so. But in the Jacksonville case, I think we've got something here that is really important, right? So to me, there's maybe a really important story, and I think Ann and Sarah were hinting at it, but basically structural racism, by that I mean redlining, interacts with property rules to perpetuate a low performance equilibrium. And it seems to me this is one of the most important and most fascinating things about this paper, is it sort of gives us a little window into this, like, okay, you know, why would anybody in the presence of redlining, why would I bother to go to the trouble of clarifying property rights? And eventually that comes back and it creates as I said, this kind of vicious circle. So if we think about it, and the paper does talk about how expensive it would be to clean up property registries and do this, but maybe there's actually a structural public case for paying that cost, because if it's actually structural racism which created heirs property in the first place, or created this kind of preponderance of it, the question is, who pays for undoing the mess that's been created? So I wish I was trying to come up with a clever identification strategy for Sarah and Ann about how you could possibly tease this apart. I'm not sure how to do that myself, but I'll leave that in their able hands to think about. So again, let me thank all the authors. I hope you found my comments useful. So Robert, back to you.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, for a really detailed analysis and commentary on these three papers. I don't see any messages in the chat, so I thought if the authors would find it useful, we got a few minutes left. If they wanted to make a response or comment on Michael's comments, and I would start with Sarah and Ann. Do you have any comments you'd like to make? I'll give you 5 minutes.
Oh, sure. I mean, first I would say, wow, thank you. That was, I think a lot of what we were hoping the presentation of this paper would help us think about and tease out are, you know, where to go next, where to go deeper, what literatures we could really interact with that we aren't. So thanks a lot. I think your interest in the endogeneity of heirs property is it really articulates something that we in doing this work, like you said, very descriptive, kind of digging in and trying to see like what's there first, and then where do we go with what we find. And the idea to use these shape files of the redlining maps to kind of overlay really was this touch point between what we understood to be kind of this embedded history of structural and exclusionary racism practices with the sort of like legal ambiguity of title. And so being able to do that and seeing the sort of significance of the overlay, we then thought, well, how do we start getting into questions of causality or relationality between these things. And so I really appreciate your insight into your thoughts on that. And certainly there is a lot to tease out there. Anne, do you have any thoughts? I mean, I'm looking over my notes from Michael's comments, but those are my most, high level thoughts at this point.
Yeah, I was very energized by those comments too, and some of the direction you gave us in literature to look at and ways to think about it. Also, I mean, spillover effects, I think we danced around that, but to be more explicit about that and maybe come up with some ways of measuring or modeling it would also be really, I think, important. And then, yeah, I think understanding the land loss issue, the scale of it, is something that I'd like to think more about. If we can find land records, partition sales, even historical partition sales, since we're looking at such a small geographical area, I think that would be a big contribution to this literature in particular on heirs property, but also on titling and land rights and such. So yes, also want to thank you, Michael. They're extraordinary comments, and we took good notes.
And
Yeah, it's actually was great to know that you found interest in doing that sort of deeper dive research into transfers, because as someone who was sort of trained as a deed dog, that gets me really excited about digging through property records and creating data sets we could use. So
I've never heard of a deed dog before, but I think
Now, if I could also just jump in too, I think one of the areas that cross-cuts all three of the papers is this idea of customary versus formal. In many respects, non-titling or heir property has been considered a customary form of land transfer, so that when you get that form of transfer and then associated with redlining, you're seeing an abutment of two different systems. So I thought that was really interesting. Okay, Krishna, do you have any comments?
Yeah, Michael, thank you so much for those really exceptional comments. All those comments are really valid. We actually struggle quite a bit about the indigeneity issue of land titling. We did test here, but and found that to be not significant. It's not endogenous, it's exogenous. But I always thought because the land titling is coming from the center level, so villagers had no take on whether they want to take the land titling process or not. But your comment about where they are implementing this first, more often, that would be really interesting to look at. I will go back to the data and find out where land titling was implemented first. And also, even after 2018, Michael, they finished land titling, but I was talking to my co-authors and they said even though they finished it, the land titling was given to the collective. They said well, we're done with land titling, but they were not really done with land titling. So there, there may be, and that's why, I think this land titling issue is endogenous, but in this particular one, I found exogenous, not endogenous. So, but that's always, something I thought about, writing paper with co-authors. I started when I was at LSU. So the another component about the clustering, you suggested not including land titling and looking at these different clusterings, how they would come out. I will see if they would be different, and I assume they would be different because of the variables included in the model. But I have to see that one. But your comments were really great, and I would like to get the PowerPoints if that is possible. I did take the screenshot. but if you could share those, I would appreciate it.
I will do that.
Thank you, Mike.
All right, and Klaus, any comment? Oh, you're muted. Unmute.
Unmuting helps. Yes, thank you. So I would like to echo the what my predecessor said, that the comments are very useful. I think, I mean, my sense was that transferability is really what ties these different papers together. And I think, and I mean, as Michael, as you said, there are transferability in the US requires formalization. There are costs to maintaining formalization, and these costs may not be, and of course, and there, I think the key question, at least in the US study, is whether you can find some exogenous variation. And there, I think, I mean, there is a lot of, I mean, I don't know whether you are aware of these papers that look at Indian reservation land that has also exogenously imposed restrictions on, I mean, you cannot transfer to one air only. And so I think that may be something that actually would be quite useful, at least to reference. And then, of course, the redlining is a very important exogenous variation in terms of the cost and the benefits of transferability. So I think looking at that in more detail, and also looking at how much does it cost to do a will, and what are the costs of maintaining formality, would be something very, very useful. So I think, and of course in the China study, I think Michael raised a lot of issues already. I think on the specific things, my sense is that the transferability and the ability to sell for cash crop, I mean, I think at least my understanding would be that this increases the value. And if you can sell that and transfer it, it has. So, I mean, as I'm not quite sure whether, and since it's the transfer rights much more than the inheritance rights in the case of male cash crop investment, I think that is, I mean, that actually would go through. I take the point of identification and looking a little bit more in terms of matching, which clearly will affect the exogenous or the external validity of what we find there. Even though I think in terms of internal, and they're being a little bit more careful and saying how that what are the limitations in terms of policy would clearly be important. I think one interesting point, of course, as Michael pointed out, these are not perfectly matched surveys. So I think definitely that is something that we can take care but and highlight a little bit more. But clearly I found the papers very interesting and also quite complementary from the 3 different continents, I think. And Michael, thanks a lot for helping us to identify some common thread and areas for taking things forward.
Great, okay.
Spiro, you have some comments? Or like you can.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'd like to say these 3 papers really take important steps forward here. You know, land is arguably the most important asset a household holds, whether it's living in Jacksonville, certainly being able to leverage it into agricultural activity. Assembling these kind of data is a prime challenge. These are not databases we have sitting around. It takes expertise across disciplines to pull it together. And you know, that's just the first challenge that lays before us. You know? And the authors are to be commended for making this effort. The methodological issues, Michael, you all point out, or the authors point out, you know, once we assemble these data, you know, need attention, you know, and need effort and need investment from research groups, research agencies like my own, and others. So that's that is, you know, a significant step forward. So I don't want to minimize this effort here at all. So I want to just offer important thanks here to our authors, to Anne, to Sarah, Klaus, Krishna. Appreciate the efforts that Michael Carter put in to try to tie some of this work together, offer very constructive steps